In those days, I begin my story. When we were a younger and smaller family and pre-military, we lived in the city of Phoenix, Arizona. I was completing school, Rose was working, and our kids were arriving and making their small mark in the world in which we live. Wanting the best for our kids, Rose and I sifted through the numerous schools that were available for preschool and early elementary education, in which to send our kids that they might learn when they become the right age. Of course, Lauren Jr. Didn't know you were going to be in this message this morning, did you? Our oldest was the first to approach that right age. The first one to try things out on, so to speak. Because, we all kind of are experimenting as we go along and we start off with kids. It just happens that way. And a large part of the determining factors for us in finding these schools was that of affordability. The first school that Lauren Jr. went to was a Methodist church school for 2 days a week. And I still remember that first day that Lauren Jr. walked away from my protective hand to begin his academic rigors. I think it was a harder time on me than it was on him. I was excited, though, to pick him up that first day so I could learn about his new experience and the new adventures that he was now embarking on. I arrived at the school on time, and I signed him out, took his hand and walked into our vehicle. I got him all buckled in, and I asked the familiar question that many ask their kids after a day of school. So what did you learn today? The answer, however, was perplexing, to say the least. As he said, nothing really. We just played. I was a little let down, and I remember thinking maybe the school, they were teaching these kids by helping them have fun and play games. However, time after time, when I asked Lauren this very same question, he would give me a very similar response. I thought about taking him out and taking him someplace else, but you see, his cousin, my sister's oldest boy, was also in his class. And the teachers there were really nice, and I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt. The next year, though, we decided to try another school for his pre-kindergarten year. And this one was a Lutheran school. And if I might say, the difference was like night and day. When I would pick up Lauren Jr. from here, he would tell me all about his day and what they were doing with class, with letters and numbers and Bible stories, and how fun it was. And at that, I was greatly relieved. I now trusted that he was in a truly fine learning program and that this would prepare him to meet the academic challenges ahead. What I was surprised about, though, came when we had our first school program, which came during the Christmas season. When we as parents were invited to see the program that all the school kids had been working on to give us a demonstration of all that they had been learning. It was remarkable. I remember sitting down in this nice church edifice in the pews there, ready and proud to view this chip off the old block. And he was going to make me proud somehow. It was a typical church school Christmas program with all the Christmas carols in the enactment. And many of the songs that we sing here today, they did too. But when it was time for the pre-kindergarten to do their part, they processed to the front of the church and then began to recite from memory the entire Christmas story from the book of Luke. So, as you can imagine, when Arthur, my next son, was of age, he got to go to school there too. And then too, when the Christmas time came around that first year, he too got up there, unintimidated. and recited from memory the entire Christmas story from the book of Luke. I will never forget how animated these adorable little children were, especially when it got around to the response that the shepherds had in having this visitation from these angels from on high, and how the shepherds, probably reacted to this announcement of the awe-filled birth of the Messiah. And these little pre-Kers, they were so vivacious, so full of life and conviction when they said, and they were terrified. I remember I thought, well, it didn't look like they were terrified. I'm sure that the shepherds were. Our gospel reading in Luke chapter 2 begins like this. And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. The census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. The Christmas story, which we read about each year, happened in a very particular time and place in history. A time that has particular characters, and the times which are largely determined by the powers that be of those times. And here we heard this morning that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered, each to his own town. This census was taking place in all of the Roman kingdom and was required by all of its subjects. And that's how history happens in those days. Those days were marked by the census being enforced by the Roman Empire. And in the narrative this morning, we find out that it was also required of the Jews as well. These were dark times for the Jews. A time of uncertainty, living as a conquered people under the rule of another empire. Also in the biblical narrative, we find that the lives of the characters were also facing some uncertainty in their lives, unsettling events. Mary found out that she was with child even though she was not married. I'm sure that was a big surprise. Joseph found out about this pregnancy too, and that he wasn't the father. That might have even been a bigger surprise. The shepherds received a visitation of angels in the dark of night to announce the blessed birth. As the biblical narrative continues from Advent and into Christmas, in our gospel reading today, we look at a story that begins with a threatening decree by an emperor, the Emperor Augustus, and it ends with a joyful proclamation and praise from the shepherds. Look at a story that begins with people living in fear and ends with people living in the freedom and joy of the announcement from the angel of the Lord who said, "Do not fear. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people." And this proclamation, "Do not fear," is repeated by the angels time and time again. The Gospels list some 125 Christ-issued imperatives. Of these, 21 urge us to not be afraid, or not fear, or to have courage, or to take heart, or to be of good cheer. The second most common command, to love God and neighbor, is only mentioned on 8 occasions. If quantity is any indicator, Jesus takes our fears very seriously. The one statement he made more than any other was this: don't be afraid. We learn in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. But what about our times? How can that help us today? Do we live in times of uncertainty? Do we know people who still live their lives in fear? When history books looks back at the years 2020 and 2021, what will be said about in those days? How will the times we are living in right now be remembered? I mean, when I think about the dreadful days of 9/11, 2001, and the tragic events that took place that day, and all that has happened since because of those dark times, living in fear brings with it many restrictions on life. I don't know about you, but can you remember when you could go with your friends or your loved ones all the way to the gate of an airport when they were going on a trip somewhere? Or you could go all the way to the gate to receive those same friends and loved ones when they returned. Where did that go? Do you remember when you could go to an amusement park or a concert or a sporting event without being checked and rechecked and sometimes physically violated before you could go there? C.S. Lewis wrote about times of fear during the atomic age. And he wrote, "In what way we think a great deal too much of the atomic bomb. How are we to live in an atomic age? I am tempted to reply, why? As you would have lived in the 16th century when the plague visited London almost every year. Or as you would have lived in a Viking age when raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat any night. Or indeed, as you are already living in an age of cancer, an age of syphilis, an age of paralysis, an age of air raids, an age of railway accidents, an age of motor accidents. In other words, do not let us begin by exaggerating the novelty of our situation. Believe me, dear sir or madam, you and all whom you love were already sentenced to death before the atomic bomb was invented. And quite a high percentage of us were going to die in unpleasant ways. We had indeed one very great advantage over our ancestors: anesthetics. But we have that still. It is perfectly ridiculous to go about whimpering and drawing long faces because the scientists have added one more chance of painful and premature death to a world which already bristled with such chances, and in which death itself was not a chance at all, but a certainty. This is the first point to be made. And the first action to be taken is to pull ourselves together. If we are all going to be destroyed by an atomic bomb, let that bomb, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things. Praying, working, teaching, reading, listening to music, bathing the children, playing tennis, chatting to our friends over a pint and a game of darts. Not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about bombs. They may break our bodies. A microbe can do that, but they need not dominate our minds. And now, since we live in this current, epidemic or pandemic, what has been taken away because of fear? How will these days be remembered? We've gone from wearing masks for 2 weeks to affect the curve in a good way, the curve, to mandating an untested vaccine to be able to work and feed your family. The powers that be have kept churches from being opened, children from going to school except online, families and friends kept apart not only on a daily basis, but on those special occasions and holidays, secluded and disconnected. We have countless loved ones of people who have died isolated and alone because of COVID restrictions on visitation. We too live in dark times. But we too can listen to the good news that the angel proclaimed this morning, because that message was for us as well. Do not be afraid. For behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. These are God's eternal inbreaking words to humankind now and forever. For you and for me. Do not be afraid. Just believe. Christ took on flesh and dwelt among us to bring us peace. A peace that says we don't have to live in fear, and we can live our lives more abundantly because of the Christ who lives in us. Are you guys still awake out there? Let me say that again. Christ took on flesh and dwelt among us to bring us peace. A peace that says we don't have to live in fear. Amen. And we can live our lives more abundantly because of the Christ who lives in us. Amen. Christ said, in this world you will have trouble. But do not be afraid. Be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. May it be so with you. May it be so with me. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Amen.